Bentley, how are you?
Hey, Nyambura, what's up?
It's very lovely to be in this conversation with you, especially because we've been chatting for the last 40 or so minutes, but more of the same. Yeah, so let's just get right into it and with our first question. So I'm interested in how you came to this documentary, like why this topic, why these particular people, but also like the connection between the film and your graduate studies. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
mhm.
So thank you first of all, for hosting me for No Direct Flight. This is an awesome film program and discussions and live everything. And I can't wait for the in-person versions to return. But in the meantime, it means a lot that we'd have a conversation about this, that people can join in. So I think that's awesome. For Revolution from Afar, the long story, slightly less longer, is that I'm from the US. I grew up in Chad. I was very familiar with Sudan. Culturally speaking, there's a lot of Sudanese music. Even the dialects are very similar between Chad and Sudan, intertwined politics, people as well. The Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir, when I was a kid, I would see his poster on the wall and in Chad. And that shows how much the countries are intertwined. So when Sudan was going through popular uprising and protests you could say they began decades ago, but you could also say they began end of 2018 and into 2019 until Omar al-Bashir, the president, was deposed. This to me was a huge moment. I couldn't believe this. I feel like for the African continent in general, for Sudan as a country, for the region, for the world, this was like a historical moment that was not being covered in international media and definitely not US media. And you had to like flip through the New York Times to find like a paragraph about a ruler who had been in power for 30 years being deposed by popular uprising. I thought it was just weird. It was ironic. You would expect the American media to at least co-opt that and say like, oh, democracy and all this shit. And it wasn't even happening. So I figured since a lot of my research in my PhD program, which is a practice-based film situated degree for me, I felt like why can't I maybe cover this and give some light to what's going on. Then I realized quickly that I wouldn't be able to go to Sudan and that it wasn't maybe the right thing for me to try to just sort of like solicit stories from people inside and outside Khartoum. In fact, I felt that it was bizarre not being a part of this. Actually, I had worked, my first job out of college was as an election observer in Sudan. And I also was part of the referendum for the South to secede from the North as well. It's my first job out of college. So I did live in Sudan. I did travel a lot in Sudan. I felt very connected. Even in the political sense, I knew a lot of the names that were being thrown around and things that were happening. So it's very bizarre not to go. And I figured, well, if I feel this and I'm not Sudanese, what about my friends who are Sudanese, who had many of them been exiled in America or their parents had left during Omar al-Bashir's regime? What does it feel like for them? So then I started investigating the psychological impact of this, the feeling of being cut off from a revolution in the United States, and caught up with friends of mine, Sudanese American artists, musicians, who were throwing together events to raise awareness about what was going on in Sudan. And that's sort of the genesis of the story.
That's actually something which I'd been curious about. How did you find these people who you're asking these questions? So, I mean, that answers that question.
Mm-hmm.
And because, as you said, the people in this documentary are all Sudanese Americans. So, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that in your biography is that you are what they call a third culture kid yourself. So,
Mm-hmm.
like did that position as a person who has this thing in common with the people who you're following, did it help in the making of the film, in like being able to have a connection with the people
Yeah.
whose experiences you're following?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's kind of the opposite of what I experienced. I was a kid who went to, actually Nairobi was one of my first places to travel as a young kid outside of the United States, which is, so shout out to Nairobi, shout out to Tanzania. We got some Tangawizi behind me on the wall over here. It's flipped. And that arriving in a new country, learning a new language, trying to fit in however possible, even when you don't look like you fit in, was like the story of my upbringing, and that idea of belonging is quintessential to me. So I think that quest for belonging is echoed very strongly in the film, in the characters in this film. And it's not just a belonging to Sudan, it's a belonging to America as well, and trying to balance both of those. You hear the characters or the people in the film ask very often, am I Sudanese? Am I American? Am I both? Zainab, one of the musicians, says, why can't I be both? I'm this 100%, I'm that 100%, right? Bayadir, Mohammed Usman, Bayadir, the poet, says, I'm Sudanese. I look Sudanese. Even that we can contest. Like, what does it even mean to look a nationality or an ethnicity or culture? I look Sudanese, but I don't speak Arabic to the extent that I could even enjoy Arabic poetry. So how am I Sudanese? And I'm a poet. How am I then Sudanese? So this navigation of identity is quintessential for me. And it's something that is very strongly rooted in the film. And that, yes, I connect to as a filmmaker to the story. And it's the energy for this film.
Yeah, that came out very clearly. Like, I always feel like you can, as a viewer, you can tell the gaze of the person who's making this film. And I generally try as much as possible when watching something to not read too much before I go into the thing. So when I read this afterwards, I was like, I see it. Actually, it comes through. So you were talking about there are poets, there are spoken word artists, there are musicians, and so on in who are like the subjects of the film. So, and the music is also very memorable. Like one of the people in the film has performed a lot of the music, or I mean, like, the music is from the people who we are following. So I'm curious if this was planned from the outset. That art is so central to the film. Was this something that was planned from the outset, or was it something that happened organically?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm posting a link to our discussion right now so people can join from Twitter here. The music, the role that music and the performance plays in the film is partly intentional. Like we knew this would be part of the project, and partly serendipitous, largely serendipitous at the same time, if it's fair for me to say this. So one of the first people that came to mind when I thought about shit, like, I wonder how my friends are feeling, my Sudanese American colleagues, is Rami Dawood. Rami was the actor in the film Faisal Goes West, which was a drama that's kind of like another flip of my own life. So like a family moving from Sudan to the US, whereas my family moved from the US to Chad. And it was a film that we explored. So Faisal Goes West, we explored what does it feel like to not fit in and to be very awkward and to try to navigate your identity and this kind of thing as a teenager, for example, in the film. So Rami had acted that role. Rami's also a rapper, and he has some works actually in the film. They lean towards spoken word as well. And Rami had been invited to New York to perform at the book launch for Khalid Albeh, who is a Sudanese Gulf-raised political cartoonist, who's a fantastic individual with very nice insight onto a lot of these things, identity, the sort of hybrid identity, global society, as well as the political. So Khalid had invited several musicians to be part of this, I say book launch. It was also at the same time, it was like a big art exhibit in New York, and invited several people to partake in that. So the people that were lined up to perform there are the ones I reached out to join in the first discussion in the film. So Khalid invited me, I came to New York as well. And so because they were all performing, that's how I got in touch with them. That's how I organized that room. It wound up being all men in that first conversation that you see in the film. And I was very excited. I'll go ahead and talk about this. I know this is one of our questions as well. It wound up being all men. And I was so excited after the conversation. I'm like, oh, it's great. Like, they were sharing so many things. We heard about like the experience, the anguish, the guilt, the despair. It was a vulnerable conversation. Everyone's so generous, all those kind of things. And I shared this with friends, and they were like, wait, you're going to make a film that's all men talking about the Sudanese revolution? And I was like, yeah. They're like, no. No. And at the time, to be honest, I do want to, for the filmmakers out there, this was a film that had basically zero funding. I got like a small academic grant before I started, like when I pitched the original idea, and I got some academic funding later on, but it's compared to the film budgets, it's nothing. It's like a zero thing. So I'm basically following what I feel is appropriate for this story. Once I have the story, I stop, edit the film, and get it out there. So that's why it was a very quick turnaround on this film as well. And why it's not as we don't have a sales agent. It's not as like, high profile and that kind of thing as some other projects, because we didn't shop it around. I wanted to get it out. So back to the conversation thing. So at the same time that Khalid's event was being organized in New York, the annual Sudanese American Public Affairs Association conference was being organized to take place in Colorado, which is where I do my PhD. So I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Fell into my lap. And Rami was coming there too. Sin Kane, another person who participated in New York, was gonna be in Denver. And now was my chance to reach out to other artists, poets, musicians, including women. And to balance this like single gender kind of thing, I did do an all women's conversation, which I think had a very different tone. And it was awesome to have those two balance each other. They kind of like are edited in a way that they are juxtaposed. Even the arrangement of the seats and perspective is the opposite. It's flipped of the men's one. And then in the end, I encourage the deconstruction of binarized gender anyway. So I was like, last conversation, everybody there, talk about whatever you want. We're not even gonna mention, male, female, whatever, this kind of thing. Because as Sin Kane says, this conversation now has united us as Sudanese people, no matter what we identify as individuals, and actually incorporates that diversity of identity as individuals.
Yeah, again, you're doing that thing where you're anticipating my questions, which I love. I love it for us because I love the flow of this conversation. Because I noticed that I say to myself, originally before the women came on, I was like, well, I have questions, because also women were such a prominent part of the revolution in Sudan. And I was like, okay, so y'all are just going to go halfway across the world and not have a single woman? And then so when the women came on, I was like, oh phew, a bit almost like you have redeemed yourselves. But I always find it interesting to hear about the process behind like what led to this decision or that decision or whatever, sort of seeing how the sausage is made and realizing, well, okay, yeah. And also about that mixed conversation, I feel I think someone had cue cards or something. Was that who came up with this idea of like some questions to prompt certain conversations? Was this something that came from your end or your co-producer, or was this something that happened that the group was like, let's have some key topics we want to discuss or something like that?
This was inspired by YouTube shows, actually. So I think it's like I always forget the names, like the And Project or something, something. And then Lineup is another like subset where they ask people questions about identity and you like guess everyone's identity and stuff. So one of these does involve flipping note cards, and you're prompted to just talk about questions that you hadn't prepared for in advance. That's the origin of that thing. We see this more in the final conversation, but all of them had note cards. All of them were led by a moderator per se who had note cards and could guide the conversation. For the first conversation with the men, it was just me. I'd written the questions, maybe with Rami. We were staying in the same Airbnb together, so I can't remember if we co-wrote. And then for the last conversation, Atif Makawi is the co-producer of the film. He's Denver-based, had a lot of excellent equipment. He's also way more talented than I am as a camera person and operator, and is a genius in general. He's a Sudanese American going through this own identity questions himself in a beautiful way. And so I remember sitting down at like a Chipotle or something in Denver, writing and refining these questions for the final group.
Speak to us a little bit about that, actually, because I'm always curious about this process of having a co-producer. What does that look like, in terms of the creative process, and also like, did it help that your co-producer is, I don't know why I'm saying the past tense, is a Sudanese American filmmaker? I mean, like, as you've already spoken about, the skill he brought to it and so on, but like, on what other levels did this collaboration work?
Yeah. So I'll toss you something else I hope you get excited about here. We'll see. Is this questions now of agency. Who can tell what stories, right? So I'm in a PhD program in America with a bunch of, let me say, I don't know if they're listening, but like white liberals, right? So progressives. So they love diversity, they love inclusion, they love new stories, all this kind of stuff. But I don't believe them. Like what gets left out of after all their efforts and all the discussions is belonging. It's the exact same belonging I'm talking about here. And so some people would say, okay, my story as a third culture kid growing up in Chad from America, yes, it prompts me to understand the third culture experience of the people I'm interviewing here, but they're still different. I mean, they still are different individuals who live different stories, right? So in one sense, I want to say, do I have the authority to write questions, for example, for these participants? Like, can I write deep enough questions? Like, are they just copying, are they projecting my views of identity onto the participants? And in one sense, I'm like, well, yeah, I can write those, and let's see how they respond. I don't have control over how they respond. That's going to be the interesting part. The other sense is like, you know what? All the agency, storytelling, who tells stories thing aside, it's nice to have Makawi there, because like I said, Makawi has directly experienced being a Sudanese American, like growing up Sudanese American. And so I have to be honest here and say he had insight into some of these questions and some of the directions the conversations could go that I still don't have, just because his individual experience is closer to that of some of the participants. So there would be things that I was like, oh yeah, let's hear this. Like, do you think that so-and-so would say this and that? And he'd be like, yo, man, that's effing annoying. Like, can we scratch that conversation? Like, I don't want to hear. He's like, you know, some things people would say, he's like, it's a little bit, it bothers him, you know? He's like, I think when someone expresses X, like they express like, oh, at the same time, yeah, I'm 100% Sudanese and I'm going to go back and live in Sudan and I'm going to like lead the new revolution. He's like, no, I'm not, you know, like, so it was very nice to have that perspective, even though, as you can hear right now, that perspective actually offered a lot of difference from some of the general directions that the conversations would go.
Yeah, I always feel a way about, I think we've already given ourselves permission to say this. I feel a way about white people telling certain stories or being like the ones who are front and center. So it's always good to know, like, he wasn't a diversity hire. It was like built into, it was baked into the making of the film. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're saying all the right things. I mean, I think I made it clear that we pre-gamed on this conversation, but I continue to enjoy it.
Yeah, we definitely had a pre
Yeah, so we're going to shift a little bit and talk about the look of the film. I found it very curious that it's in black and white. And originally, I think there's a point where there's some footage of Omar al-Bashir. And as I was watching, I was like, well, this is old stuff, blah, blah, blah. The color is going to come at some point. And we went on and on and on, and no color in sight. And so I wondered about that, like what informed this decision, because it makes the documentary very striking. Like visually, it's as I say, very striking. But I always wonder about that, like what makes you choose this over that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it, like everything else, has at least two answers from me, and probably contradicting answers too. So bear with me. After the first performances in New York, I was riding the subway home with Rami, super late at night, and we were looking at footage. And Rami, I had been shooting in color. Rami said, this was going to look amazing in black and white. And I was like, what? You're telling me? Like, what do you mean it's going to look amazing in black and white? And so I flipped it and took a look at it, and it's true. It looked pretty interesting. And so from the aesthetic side, there are photographers and theorists who will write about how black and white or monochrome in general has somehow cognitively the power to accentuate lines and shapes and contrasts in a way that might get lost in color, just sort of like cognitively or psychologically. Because a lot of these scenes are shot in like built spaces that are for performance, and the hotel conference rooms, and these are otherwise actually some of them kind of boring places too, the hotel especially, they all have these lights and weird, like there's like spotlights on the wall that create these like ovular shapes over here and stuff. And I think that in that sense, the black and white actually helps to make that space interesting. The second answer I have is more theoretical, and this is where I use in my PhD program to justify this thing, right? Is that there is no canon of third culture hybrid identity filmmaking. I mean, there are films that have characters that are balancing identities, they deconstruct identities. I've written a little bit about Mohammed Saleh Haroun's film, Bye Bye Africa, from Chad, which I think he was kind of having a plight for I don't belong anywhere anymore. I think that's kind of one of the messages of that film, of a filmmaker who's left Chad to study filmmaking in France, comes back to Chad for his mother's funeral, wants to make a film, can't make the film. But actually, this is the film about that, not making the film kind of thing. And I think that he actually had this sort of plea of disidentification, to bring up the Jose Esteban Munoz term from queer studies as well, that often we align ourselves with identity, we kind of like test that out for a bit, and oh my God, like I don't feel represented even within the demographic I'm like working within or the discourse I'm in right here. I also have this way to complicate my identity. After some time, I don't really even feel that you know can summarize who I am. Therefore, I am nothing. I am neither. You know, this kind of deal. So the things that these characters are talking about in the film are, to me, they're kind of new. They're kind of unique because they're directly talking about these ideas of belonging. And I don't remember many films that do this. So I like the idea of black and white in that, in a way, it flattens visually the film. In a way, right? I just said it highlights contrast in the built spaces and stuff, but it kind of flattens visually the experience to where I hope you concentrate on the words of the characters. And then also the black and white gives them a seriousness and a sort of feeling of, even if it's a trick, of historicity. You feel like you're watching a classic film at some moments, right? And I'll be open, like I've added film grain, all kinds of stuff to kind of trick you into into feeling the thing that I want you to feel, which is like just like respect. Like, oh my God, what are these characters saying? Okay, good. Oh wow, she said, oh, okay. And we're gonna look over here. We're not distracted by this Western trope of like, oh, look at the colors and the identities, and oh my God, they're Sudanese, but they're so diverse within Sudan. And that's not my goal. My goal is what these people have to say.
That comes across really clearly because there is some work even your mind is forced to do in the presence of color. It's like, for instance, now when we're looking at, remember when your screen came on and I was like, that's a Tanzanian flag and this and that, but like half of this stuff doesn't register if you can't see color. And that sounds like the sort of thing people are like, I don't see color, but you know what I mean. And so yeah, we are sort of compelled to we're compelled to really pay attention to what the people we are watching are saying and doing, and not so much, all the trappings of the spaces they're in. So
another thing that is in the film I want to add to that, where I don't always get a chance to talk to people who can see this film from their perspective that might be very close to what the characters have experienced, right? We've been doing these international film festivals, a lot of Black film festivals in the United States, a lot of African themed film festivals, but everyone kind of projects their own thing, which is a beautiful thing. That's part of the reading of a film. But it's very interesting also at the same time to see how the identity is complicated throughout the film. And that, from my perspective, coming from Chad, so like we talk about white supremacy. White supremacy is a thing. And for me, I define white supremacy as the idea that white is right. So the default assumption that if you're living in this sort of white way, and I extend it to culture, it's not just phenotype, like appearance, but white culture in a way, that all of us are practicing some form of white culture, right? Always. And like the more we can be fluent in the white culture, the more we seem like functional as individuals in a society. That's what I'm looking to challenge in one way. And that's what all these characters in this film obviously are aware of, like they talk about explicitly in the film. There's other forms of supremacy that are within the specific film that I think may have parallels to other places. One is the idea already in the third culture space that for some people to be American, to be one of the identities, the national identities, is superior, right? So the more American they code, the better, the cooler they are, the more a potential they have, the bigger the bigger chance they have of making it big, this kind of thing, which has had its roots in the American dream and all kinds of ideas of assimilation and all kinds of stuff. Another side of it here is this positioning to be more Sudanese, right? Because if you're more Sudanese, like the more quote unquote, this is like another term I'd have issue, authentic you are, right? The bigger your state can be in the revolution, the more the Sudanese you code culturally. So there's that positioning as well. But there's also a shadeism and a sort of like Arab supremacy that is a huge thing in Sudan. And I know this is like, we talked about this before, this is also kind of a trope that a lot of the documentaries, the humanitarian documentaries about South Sudan will say like, oh, if we didn't have this Arab supremacist Islamist regime, then people wouldn't have been killed, they wouldn't have been ostracized and marginalized for all these years, which is a very true thing. But I'm very critical of how are we as individuals playing out the Arabism and the Shadism even now as like enlightened liberals and all this shit. It means nothing if we're subconsciously still playing out the Shadism and the Arabism and that kind of thing too. And this, what happens in diasporic gatherings of Sunni people is that usually you don't have many people from West Sudan, so like Darfur. Usually you do not have people from South Sudan. Now being officially excluded is literally like an exclusion in a lot of diaspora events. But even in the past, it would be a lot of northern tribes where what happens is this thing, I don't have any answers for it, but you have people who are in Sudan, they are the privileged, they're like the white supremacist, like hated people. Like when you go to southern areas, marginalized spaces outside of Khartoum, they'll talk about these tribes, and I won't say them because Sunnis audience will know them anyway, but like northern-based tribes that are known to control the security services and they have access to power. And Omar Bashir was from one of these tribes, the president himself for 30 years. So this is the tribe of privilege. All the access, all the connections, all the under the table dealings and powers and privileges are rooted in these tribes. When these people go to the US, often it's actually to avoid that, like to escape that, or for economic reasons, to start over, like to have a new life in a way. And now they're shaking being a marginalized minority in America. So now they're not the hegemony in America. And that space is huge to me as well. And so I know there's ways to like argue against this, but I think to kind of like distract the audience, even for a second, into thinking like, oh, wow, this is a beautiful, like diverse set of voices from Sudan. It's not even touching on the diversity of what Sudan is. And I think the characters are acknowledging that. And that's why I'm kind of like trying to centralize the conversation onto what have they experienced as people? Like, let's be really real about what we can talk about in this space. What have the individuals in this room experienced? That's what I want to hear. That's what I want to focus on.
Well, and speaking of the individuals and this like marginalization of say Western voices, Haja in the film points that out. She says, people talk about how what's happening in Sudan right now is essentially what's been happening in Darfur, and we've not seen a similar amount of attention. Nobody turned their profile pictures blue, etc. And it's a really moving moment because I mean, as I was watching, it was like, my heart, and of course, like as you're saying, those things are tied to like issues of colorism and like these ideas that come from your home country and some of which get transposed in the diaspora. So how did you make room for such conversations? Because it was clearly not a comfortable conversation. Like you could tell that it was a turn that was I don't know, as I said, it was a really moving moment. I watched it and I was like, well, okay, sis, thank you very much for saying this, but I also want to see how, the rest. It was not a comfortable moment. If I'd been in the position of the other people in the room, I'd be like, well, so how do you make room for such conversations? Because I also feel like it's sometimes easy to end up in this moment when you're having like, I don't want to say comfortable conversations, but like we're all in agreement about this, we are all one, we all share these values, and for someone to be like, actually in a way I am apart from you in this way, and I'd like for us to acknowledge that was really powerful. So how do you, and you talked about how like there are essentially all these cue cards and stuff, but how do you have enough space for such conversations to emerge?
This is an amazing question. And I can tell, I mean, like I'm saying, like you're reading through the film, like you're hearing what Hajar is saying in that moment. You're seeing the vulnerability and it's speaking to you. And I love that. Like that makes me very happy that has happened at the level of audience here. This is also a case where I can't claim any responsibility for what happened in that conversation because I owe that vulnerability and that power and the words shared to the people that were in that conversation. Hajar specifically and Ilaf, who she interacts with, they talk back and forth, where they had gone had pretty much exceeded where the note cards had guided them, if this makes sense. So they now have entered a territory that is beyond the design of the conversation. And specifically to cue people up to this that may or may not have seen the film, Hajar is from Darfur. She is talking about a visit to Darfur when she was a little bit younger, in which she saw the destruction of the Sudanese military / Janjaweed paramilitary, however you want to understand it. on a village, and she talks about people who had endured this attack. And Ilaf is listening to the story and is emotionally moved, and eventually says, "I want to apologize." And you're like, "What the hell? Why are these two people in a conference room in Denver apologizing to each other?" Because my family and myself, we're guilty of promoting a narrative that this is war, it's complicated, people die in war, kind of thing, right? And I'm summarizing what she says, so I don't want to take away her words, but and I want to come out and say myself, I have done that. So you asked about the connections to Sudan, these kind of things, and the Chad thing, because Chad was one of the places where Darfur refugees would resettle as a kid. And in my next film, actually, I have footage of this. I as a kid, I was filming aid trucks go from N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, to Abeshe in the east, and to camps outside of Abeshe with food and supplies and these kind of things. And Chad was very implicated in the Sudan, Darfur stuff. So I didn't want to have a simplistic narrative that matched the do good documentaries and the George Clooney's and the Angelina Jolie's, who like to keep things simple and say, oh, it's an Arab Islamist regime, they're racist, they're killing Black people, because it isn't that simple, okay? But in doing so, I also negated the ostracization, marginalization, and oppression that was being carried out on those groups. So I would say things like, hey, well, they have a militia, they're fighting back, they have a rebel army. And I'm thinking about in the context of Chad, there's really no good side, right? It's like one corrupt side versus like the less corrupt side versus the like slightly less corrupt side, like this. There's no like sort of moral hero. So I'm like, you have to complicate this. But in doing so, I feel guilty of, and Ilaf even, apologized in this film, of minimalizing and taking away from the pain and oppression that these people endured. And so the fact that she apologizes and they're both like breaking down in tears and they hug and everything is this like mind-blowing, powerful moment in the film that I'm eternally grateful to both participants for just opening themselves for, and it has spoken very powerfully to a lot of audiences since then.
I've found, because there's been quite, like a rise in diasporic writing from, like Sub-Saharan Africa and so on. But I think that's been happening is also that the continent is speaking back to the diaspora, so to speak, and saying it's a certain sort of person who gets to leave the country. It's a certain sort of person who gets to, quote unquote, represent the country, So the Kenyan, for instance, who you see in the US or in the UK, or the Kenyan community you see in the diaspora might not necessarily be representative of the place they're coming from, but they create a sort of new identity in being in this space, a new Kenyanness, a new Sudanese-ness, and so on and so forth. And yeah, so I really enjoyed that, because also I find that generally we rarely see such moments, even within, like in Kenya, for instance, we rarely see smaller tribes or whatever having the sort of forum where they speak back to, these larger groups that dominate the conversation, dominate national debate, and which, let's be honest, also make life really difficult for, people from smaller groups and so on. So yeah, this is a powerful moment, powerful stuff. So another thing that's been happening during No Direct Flight, because we've been at this this is day 9. So one we've been at this so long, I've forgotten how to count. But one of the people who's been involved with this film season is this historian, Nairobi-based historian called Chao Maina, and she's really interested in archives. And I am known within my friend group as like, the person with the most archival impulse. It means I take a lot of pictures. Okay. So I'm interested in the work of archives in like connecting the past and the present, and like, because there was some archival footage and so on. So how do you go about incorporating that? But also, like this, you're documenting something that's really recent. I mean, like when I finished watching the film and I was like, it says 2020, I mean, it was obviously from the recent past, because like these are not events from 10 years ago. I mean, like the revolution is not is a very recent thing. So, how do you
Yeah.
go about incorporating, archival footage, archival information, and so on and so forth? And related to this, what sort of like fact checking goes into into a process like this, or is it just one of those, we'll take whatever the person tells me, you know what I'm saying? Telling me tells me. Yeah. So I feel like that's a
Fantastic question.
double question. Mhm.
Well, and it's an interesting one because this film is not an archival film. It's not an archival assembly film. It's not just based on archives. The archival material, however, is spread throughout the film as a motif. It's common all the way until the end of the film. In my mind, I've blocked that because I'm thinking about the present. I'm thinking about the people that are in the conversations. Like I said, my focus is this identity, this balance of identity. But I also intentionally brought back mostly videos of protests and chants in Sudan, and a little bit of footage from actual violence on protesters that happened in this very traumatizing event at the end of Ramadan in 2019, last year, in which the protesters, basically to summarize, after Bashir was deposed, there was still this struggle to secure civilian government, civilian control over the country's future. There was a military council that was sort of like putting in these puppet leaders here and there, and this is still continuing to this day, depending on who you ask, right? And as a response, I started watching these like Facebook lives of friends of mine who were involved in this, and they were broadcasting from Khartoum. As a response, protesters built, I guess you would call it a fake city, or like a constructed city, like a completely constructed like space right in front of the military headquarters in Khartoum that was referred to as the sit-in or the Itisam, or by its nickname, the headquarters, the Al-Qiyada, like it's right next to the military HQ. That was the name used as well. And this literally bringing bricks and like tires and things to build a constructed city. And they would say, like, if you won't give us our civilian government, we're building our place right here in front of your military's face. And this is like, again, the fact this is not on international media blows my mind to this day, blows my mind. Like, how does Tiananmen Square is like lingers in the psyche of a lot of the quote unquote like Western countries, America, this kind of thing, as like a bold moment. How the hell is this not also in that psyche? Because it seems to evoke the ideas of, standing up for your rights that, like, I would imagine a lot of people would tend to support these days. God. Anyway, so that was happening. And a lot of artists congregated to that space as well. Musicians were giving concerts. Anyone who could draw anything on a wall was doing like these elaborate forms of wall art and graffiti and stuff. Poets were showing up. Filmmakers were documenting it. I mean, it was kind of like an art fest in some ways too. But this is also, to be critical, this is also my perspective from the outside. I'm hearing this sort of rosy picture of that. And eventually the military actually unleashed sort of like, you call that a massacre. They attacked with live ammunition and killed. Estimates are different. This is where the government underreported and the international media know what to say. And then the people who were there don't know what to say. Was it 103 people or was it 1,000 who were killed and then their bodies were deposed into the Nile River and sort of made to be forgotten, this kind of thing. So in terms of quoting the facts, just like I just said right now, it's a very difficult one because I don't think there is an objective truth to this situation beyond the accounts of different people. So I'm trying to like give you the vibe of what happened without making a big claim of like exactly these many people were killed or this kind of thing. It's a very serious matter and I don't want to actually make a claim on it. For the archive footage, this is stuff that was all publicly available on YouTube, or as I mentioned, it was from friends who had done like Facebook live streams kind of thing. And some of these videos have already gone viral among the Sudanese, not just community in Sudan, but also diaspora. Throughout the film, you'll see Sudanese people in America or Sudanese Americans, or however they identify, chanting. And a lot of these chants are, they're direct mimicking of what was happening in Khartoum. Some of them had been there during some of the protests. Some of them had not. They'd just seen these on YouTube or through whatever social media they had, Facebook, etc. And there is an important part of the discussion of belonging in Sudan and belonging as part of the revolution specifically, that is rooted in the euphoria and the power and charisma and also the grief that is visible in these chants. And so you see Rami's spoken word, he actually calls back some of these chants. Ayman Mao is a musician who appears briefly in the film as well. He had performed in that qiyada, in the Itisam space, in the sit-in space in Khartoum, and was performing in Denver at this conference center room. It's bizarre, right? This connection between those two different spaces was something that's very interesting. And that's why, as a motif, those chants are there, they're visible. They're giving you the feeling, hopefully, of the power of what these chants were. But you're also, just like the characters in the film, you're also watching it through a screen. You're not actually there. How does that make you feel? How does that make them feel?
So I'm the one who's supposed to be asking questions, Bentley, and here you are, asking us questions. But yeah, you make up a fine point. So you've touched on this more than once, but I'm just going to ask the question directly because I sent it to you already, and you're ready to answer all the questions. So all the people in the documentary are tackling like really big ideas, really big questions. So for instance, when you're putting together the cue cards, what informs the process of putting together these questions? Like, is there a focus group where you're like, okay, how does this question sound, and can we go and put it to the larger group? Or because I'm always interested in the process of getting to the questions that lead to interesting insights. So maybe I'm interested in that.
Yeah, like I said earlier too, like there was it was a tension between, I have questions, I want to just throw them out there. Then I also want to bounce them off of Makawi, the co-producer, and get his input on them. And then we both of us don't know how the group will answer them. And the group's answers are what appears in the film, more or less. So that's the content you wind up with. So it's a great question about the question. For the first two conversations, so the men and the women in separate spaces, which I mentioned was kind of like serendipitous, or was like unintentional in the beginning and then eventually became intentional. Those questions were chronologically driven through what was your experience like watching the revolution from afar. What was it like when I think one of the first questions was, what was it like when you first heard that Omar Bashir was deposed from power? And people answered it in their own ways. And that question alone sparked tons of conversation. There were some questions that eventually didn't make the final cut of the film. They felt too heavy-handed, or they felt too forced, that kind of thing. And like I said, some of the conversation that resulted from those questions, like the Hajar telling of her experience coming from a family from Darfur and having been there as a kid and reflecting on the memories, and now dealing with this trauma from afar and cut off. I mean, this is beyond the questions. So again, I'm very grateful to all the people that were in the film for making it what it is. When we got to the questions that were for the group of everyone together, regardless of gender or identity, that these questions were inspired by these shows I mentioned, like from YouTube, such as like Lineup and stuff, where you're trying to see people's opinions on something. And I actually structured them with opinion and then colon, da, 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 da. And then it's open. You can disagree, you can agree. One of them, for example, was opinion, Arabic. Well, I think it was like Sudan should have no national language, right? That's an opinion, right? And that question, what I'm going for with this question is, what can we bring in that is relevant to the revolution right now? Because that is a talking point of the revolution. Revolution, many people would say it began for economic reasons, that the price of basic goods, flour for bread, sugar, these kind of things, had risen exponentially. There was crippling inflation, and there still is in Sudan, where money was devalued and you couldn't buy basic things. That all got tied into eventually, and whether or not it was co-opted, I don't know. And that's also like part of how a political movement works too, I guess, into this idea of Arab Islamic hegemony. So it went from bread, can't afford bread, to, well, the same douchebag in power that can't let us afford bread also forces us to all identify as Arab, Islamic, Sudanese, is defining this infinitely diverse place as this one thing. And how does that play out in forms of violence, and especially in the marginalized areas outside of Khartoum. So there's so much here that is touched, unlocked with a simple question: should the country have an official language? That's kind of where we were going with that type of a question. Later on, some of these ones, and this is again, I thank Makawi for his feedback as co-producer. We talked more specifically about the ideas of belonging and being Sudanese. Like, I can't remember if this was a question on a note card or not, but at one point people were asking their own questions, which is amazing, right? We have a note card question and then the characters or the participants are asking their own questions. And they were saying things like, if you're 1% Sudanese, if you're like the children of Sudanese diaspora in Australia, and 100 years from now, you wake up and you say, oh shit, my great-great-grandfather was Sudanese. Now I am Sudanese. Are you Sudanese? So the questions like gave breath to a lot of other probably deeper and more relevant questions.
This is so interesting, and I also like I feel there's something about not just watching the revolution from afar, but also like being, watching something with a certain position. For us, for instance, like Kenya has a long history, this region generally, where we're all, linked because of the Nile, we're linked because of shared resources, shared history, etc, etc, etc. Like we were watching what was happening in Sudan very differently, but it's also, so there's a certain position you occupy. One occupies, as you're saying, like if you're 1% Sudanese, what's your relationship, but does that 1% Sudanese make you have a certain relationship to this place, which is quote unquote home, but what even does home mean? These questions, we could ask them all day, yeah. So now we'll ask a question about the filmmaking process, the post-filmmaking process, which is this film came out basically, right in time for the Pandi. What were we calling it at the beginning of this conversation? The Pandi, the panoramic. Yeah, so it came out, right in time for a global pandemic, once in a century sort of thing. So what's it been like taking your film around the world without actually going around the world? And related, one of the things that's mentioned is the Sudan Independent Film Festival. So what was that like?
Man, this is a huge question. So number one, every day I struggle with the question of, should I just put this film on YouTube? And from the sake of the film's own journey and my career as a filmmaker, all these kind of things, I don't know if the answer is yes yet, because I think it's important to have conversations like this that highlight the film and bring attention to it in a place where people see, oh, this is important, I do need to pay attention to it. Because I think if I went to YouTube directly, it would go to its niche audience, but that would be like it. Like it wouldn't have much of a growth beyond who would already see it at someday on YouTube regardless. Okay, in terms of the festival distribution, this has all been virtual festivals, with the exception of a handful that try things in person, half in person. I think we had 2 in Italy that were partly in person. We may have in the US, maybe in New York soon, might be half in person, might just be virtual, I'm not sure. And then the Sudan Independent Film Festival, which was happening in January of 2020, is the only one that was completely in person before pandemic. Even that was, this is, okay, here's where it gets interesting for this film. It's a revolution from afar, watching the revolution through a screen. Almost all discussions about this thing have been through a screen. Actually, all of them. I've never watched this film with an audience, ever, live, right? It's only been streaming, yeah. And so even Sudan Independent Film Festival, imagine I was in Saudi Arabia attending a film residency for another film I'm producing at the same time as the Sudan Independent Film Festival in Khartoum. So from Jeddah to Khartoum is an 1 hour and 10-minute flight away. It's very easy to do. As a non-Sudanese citizen, I just need a visa, and I could not get a visa. I even had tweets that were going viral about not getting visa, videos, all kinds of, couldn't get a visa because of nationalism and all this bullshit. So, and it's the same thing, by the way, I say this, people are like, but you're white and American, we try to give visas. Yes, I know, I agree. Yeah, it sucks. Visas are stupid. and borders are ridiculous, and nationalism is very backwards, even though we celebrate it as progressive today, only because it's progressive compared to effing fiefdom kingdoms and slavery and stuff. Is it progressive? Great. Great, it's progressive, great. Well, otherwise it's not, it's just a form of racism. And I'm not lamenting like racism towards me. It's just, these are rules that this country has. But I couldn't go attend a film screening at a festival because the visa process essentially was geared toward, it was a reaction to America being so hard on Sudan, basically, right? That's the political root of that. So it's this very interesting situation where the film was world premiering, an hour and 10-minute flight away, and I wasn't there. And I wanted to be there and I couldn't. And so I'm watching from afar, the screening. And then the pandemic hits, and then everything is now from afar, everything, right? This conversation right here is from afar, conversation from afar. No direct flight from afar. No flights. No, take direct out. No flight. You know. and so now, oh my God, it's funny and hopefully speaks to more people. This feeling of watching the Sudanese revolution from afar is shared with all revolutions and all movements. We're all. I'm in America and I'm watching most of the Black Lives Matter protests and marches mostly from afar. Mostly, right? Even when you go participate, it's very awkward. You're wearing a mask, you're keeping distance, all these kind of things. We are distant. We are far away from each other in so many ways while all these important events are happening. It's mind-blowing. So now it's like life from afar. It's probably the next film after.
Yeah, you're right. It's very meta, actually. Like, as you're watching it, you're like, well, okay. And that's another thing. Like, I don't know if this has been happening to you, but I find myself now when I watch films being like, these people are sitting too close to each other. And then I have to remind myself that this is from a time before we had to be far from each other. But the whole time I was like, people look a bit too cozy. They're sitting too close to each other, etc. Yeah, so I mean that's there's that element too. You know, like we're watching people watching events. There's all these layers and so on. So yeah. Wow. I mean, I'm surprised that Sudan was denying people visas because if I remember correctly, the RSF had been formed with like funding from the European Union and so on to basically keep migrants out of Europe. And so a bit of me is like, y'all were friends, y'all are friends. So I don't know. But anyway, this is a conversation we can have at another time, but there's a lot to be said about all those layers of, sovereignty and who gets to go to which countries and which countries get to support what movements and so on and so forth.
If I can interject, I apologize.
No,
if I can
please.
interject quickly, I had attended the last trip to Sudan I went on was in 2017 to the Sudan Independent Film Festival. So I was able to go that time. And it required a visa from the Minister of Culture, not the Ministry of Culture, the Minister of Culture. I rode around in his car when I was there, right? Like,
wow.
It was a time in which I was able to go and share, but it took a whole movement to kind of like get a visa and stuff. When I arrived in Khartoum is when Donald Trump, 2017, had just been inaugurated. And one of his first moves was this banning of travel, the Muslim ban from countries that like happened to be Muslim, which included Sudan. So I actually made this like stupid Instagram video or whatever of myself hearing the news and being depressed in Khartoum and turning to my friend and asking for a lighter. And they hand me a lighter and I like start lighting and then raise my US passport like this, which is ironic and stupid and a sign of all like the privilege that I have with a US passport to travel a lot of places to begin with. But also just my angst and sadness with these bans and these travel rules and these essentially racist. I mean, they're all said not to be racist because the politicians will say, oh, it's because of these economic or security reasons or something. But essentially, like you can tell one human is not giving the benefit of the doubt to the other human, and it's super frustrating.
I think about a lot is always that, art making or thinking about the world and so on. Like we are all interconnected in all of these interesting ways that we are not able to gather because of the pandy, for instance, but also that realistically, even if we had been able to gather pandy or not, some of us would not have been able to go to certain festivals because we'd have been denied visas, and that sort of thing. And like how that connects with the linkages we're able to have, the networks we're able to build, the connections we're able to have. Like, the way when you go to a festival, it's not really about the panel. Sometimes it's about the drinks you have afterwards, and then you spend time with each other, but you can't do that. It's not the same via Zoom. Like both of us are having drinks, but look at my ice cream tub, it hits different. Yeah. So yes, you said earlier that you're working on something that touches on your time in Chad. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what we can expect from you next.
Yeah, thank you. So two things right now that are all in the same archive. This is an archival driven project. One of them is a short film that was more or less commissioned by my university, where I talk about the pandemic or the pandy. Every time you say pandy, I'm thinking like the designer song, like panda, panda like that. We can make a pandy theme song. I think that'll be a third project. That's three projects coming up now. Okay, so the the pandemic being through the lens of like, what is it like to experience a pandemic in different places? And why does the pandemic lockdown remind me of life as a teenager in Chad? And I start to answer this question, it's a short film. I start to answer this question saying like, well, I feel like my life is going nowhere. Like there's nothing to look forward to. There's no travel. Like we said, there's no no flights right now, like more or less. It's difficult to have an excuse to do things, like to adventure or this kind of thing. And so it reminds me, as a teenager in Chad, we were bored out of our minds. And so with friends, like in our neighborhood and stuff, we just like created games. We built basketball goals. We invented things to do. We're like teenagers we started making movies in that time too. And actually, I mentioned I would go to Nairobi for medical meetings, like my dad is a doctor, so we go. When we're in Nairobi, we have all this commercial capitalism, which I'm sure if you're in Kenya, you're complaining. I'm sure you bitch about Nairobi all the time or something. But like for us coming from Chad, Nairobi was like heaven, because there's like movies and malls and stuff. But in Chad, we did not have that stuff. And often didn't have like electricity. Even today, there's, because of basically corruption and like nearsightedness and stuff, like even the capital city has regular electricity cuts. So you're inventive. You start creating activities, and this is exactly what people in the pandemic are like. Oh, now it's your time to write a novel or to spend time with your children or something like this. But in a way, it's very interesting. Yeah, exactly. And next there was a focus on infectious disease in Chad. Obviously, like my dad's a doctor, so not only were we vaccinated, yellow fever, meningitis, tuberculosis, all these vaccines. In Chad, my dad worked on these like, UNICEF polio vaccination campaign. So I would travel with him, and you had people then in Chad. There was like the pro-vaccine, anti-vaccination kind of thing, whatever. So all the talk about a vaccine in somewhere like America now, I'm like, oh yeah, you privileged mother, like that. Now you know what it feels like to like see your future depend on your health and like a vaccine availability, and whether you can get it. In the same narratives of like privilege and access and who wants it are all here too. So I think that stuff is like super fascinating to look at from these different lenses. So that's a short film. I haven't titled it, but that probably will go public soon. I may even throw it on YouTube at some point soon. The other thing is a feature. Firstly, I'd like to recommend, if you want to watch on YouTube, the film Ustaz, Oustaz, is a short I made to kind of like show what this feature will look like one day. I made this a few years ago. Ustaz revolves around my Arabic teacher, who's also a musician, artist, who I was very inspired by, as were a lot of people in my generation, and who died kind of prematurely. And he was depressed, and he didn't feel like he had hope to realize like all the ambitions and all the dreams and ideas he had. And that really struck me, that moment. And the feature I'm working on, the working title will probably change, but it's gone from like doctor, like doctor, or Where There Is No Doctor, which is based on a public health book that was popular like in the 70s or something. That talks about, it's kind of the lens of my brother and I growing up as kids with video cameras, documenting all this stuff, our daily lives, and starting to make movies with friends and stuff. what it was like for us to go through that identity, you could call it formation, and again, all this boredom / creativity and stuff, under the lens, under the guise of our dad's work as this like medical missionary guy who's doing these projects and NGO work to like save lives and all this stuff. And there's often talk about miracles even, and, you know, praying for a miracle and God healing people and this stuff that lingered in my psyche. As a teenager, I'm hearing these things. As a kid, we're hearing these things. And so this film investigates that. And it's all home video archive, but it goes all the way to recent times, to my, in 2017, last time I was in Chad as well, revisiting these friends, catching up with people who in the past, there was one guy named Musa, for example, that everyone understands he was healed by miracle. He had fallen down with like appendicitis, had his appendix removed, was infected, looked like he was going to die. And then he just like suddenly got better. And now this guy is more or less like unemployed, and he's like lost his vision inexplicably and stuff. So like other stuff has happened, like in the Chinua Achebe, like things fall apart vein, you know, like stuff is going to happen still. So how do you make sense of that? Do you pray for another miracle? Like, how do you navigate that? And now as a filmmaker and someone whose my values and my philosophies they've shifted since I was that age. Now I'm returning to where I was during those years and looking at it through the lens of these things that we filmed when we were kids.
That was supposed to be the last question, but I'm going to ask you one extra question because, you know, like, you're the second filmmaker I've spoken to during this season. The first was Michael Omono from the Surreal 16 Collective, who's spoken about, you know, like making a shot as a way, like a point of entry towards making a feature film. And is this something that you set out to do? Like the point of this shot is to try out certain ideas before the feature film, or is this something that happened, you know, like it just happened?
Yeah, this is some major filmmaker real talk right here. Yeah. So people talk about this, making a short to make a feature all the time. I would say it's funny. This is not like a fiction film. This is not. I mean, everything's a fiction in life, but like this is not a drama, raise a huge budget kind of film. This has been a constant realization for me that I have the resources to make this film at each step. I actually don't need that much funding or outside support to do this. And so, yes, each film has been a step to work towards the feature. Yes. And very, very much so. There's a chance to show the aesthetic of what I could work with, to learn lessons from the shorts. I've made other shorts too within this archive, to learn lessons from aesthetically. What rules am I using? Am I only using diegetic sound? Do you always see the source of the sound on screen? Music, is it music that's only performed by the people in the film? Narration, I'm narrating mostly in Arabic, a little bit in French, this kind of thing. Is that what I'm going to use in the feature, or should I do another language, or should I recraft the tone? The making the shorts / the main short Ustaz has been absolutely a way to test out ideas and to develop energy towards that feature. Now, the other side of this for filmmakers is that the whole idea of like, oh, you make a short, you get some support and make a movie out of it, is mostly BS, if I can say. Mostly because there's so much discussions of like money and power and gateway and access and sales agents and distributors and things you need backing your film before you get the money to make the feature, that I think it's almost disingenuous as a filmmaker to say like, oh, make the short and I make the feature, like that. There's so much in the middle that often is beyond your control. And here I am, I'm 33. I started making films when I was like 16 or something, and I've never gotten a grant more than like $1,000, right? And you need usually tens of thousands of dollars to even start making a film, much less the $1 million, $2 million, even indie film budgets, right? I have been very fortunate to raise money on Kickstarter for Faisal Goes West. That was an important exception where people filled that void, which is awesome. But now as a filmmaker, career filmmaker, I don't go to Kickstarter anymore for my projects. I need to make them on sort of quote unquote on my own, I guess. And I'm learning valuable lessons at 33 of I need to be involved in a market. I need to go meet producers. There's always been this struggle. Do I get a European co-producer? If you look at most films from the African continent and the Arab world that make it to like, you know, the end of the festival circuit, like a Cannes screening film or a Berlinale or Sundance, they're almost always co-production, almost always. And I had resistance to this when I was 21, 22, 23. I'm like, screw that. I don't want some French producer advising me on how to finish this film. That will inevitably change the voice of the film. It'll change the perspective of the film. It'll change the audience, the target audience, all kinds of things. And as you mature as a filmmaker, I can tell you right now, there is no escape. It sucks. It actually sucks. Like, either you make it on your own resources, and hopefully technologies get cheaper and cheaper, and the talent pool is like bigger and bigger, so we can make these things without co-producers. But right now, if you said, like, as an indie filmmaker, I want to have a film in Cannes within the next 5 years, I would say you almost have to have a European co-producer. I'm saying this with despair. I'm not happy about this, right? But this is the reality, because that co-producer unlocks funds that you can only dream of. They work in southern Germany, or like the Swiss mountains or French countryside, and they have local, like, prefecture county funds, 200,000 euros they can unlock for you, as long as you edit the film in France or something like that, right? Or as long as they send the DP to Kenya or to Chad or whatever it is, and then they have the connections later on to sell your film before it's even made, or like to negotiate essentially for representation before it's even made. Revolution from Afar, for example, is on festival circuit right now. This is by far the most successful film in terms of festivals that I've ever made. Faisal Goes West had maybe more of even a cultural kind of effect or impact. This is the most successful film in terms of festivals, and it has no sales agent. Like, there's no one representing this film. There's no distributor. I don't know if it's going to go to a streaming service or not, because I can't go physically meet these people at markets right now to make those connections and do that. It's a weird moment. I'm mostly voicing frustration here, but I want to give some real talk to filmmakers out there and future filmmakers that I endorse saying, do it now is what you now. Don't try to not trick yourself with the dream that you make a short, you turn around, make a feature. Oh, it's good. Because some people like myself make that short, like Faisal Goes West, 8 years ago, and I never made that feature. I wanted to make the feature. I never made that feature because I can't, because there's not a way to raise the money to make that film right now. So I'm doing other stuff.
Listen, I don't know if you know what you've done, because this is a conversation we are constantly having on the continent. Yeah. This whole but if you make a film with a team out of the UK, out of the European continent, out of the US, but especially Europe, as you are saying, is it still a Kenyan, Tanzanian, Ugandan, insert country here film? And what does it do to your film to have, this person from elsewhere have a significant role, or this group from elsewhere have a significant role? And I don't know, as you're saying, it's there is a note of despair when we talk about these things, because it's like loud exhalation of breath. But yeah, I think it's also important to be honest about what the process of making this work entails. What's at stake, what it takes, what's going to be possible if you don't have access to certain funds, certain spaces, certain. Let's finish on a positive note. Sorry, unfortunately.
No, really quick. I mean, we have new ways of looking at identity too that might help answer some of those questions. You were talking earlier about BBC and how BBC is it a colonial power, right? Is it just like the colonial hegemony living on forever? Because we all, like, even in America, I turn on BBC radio when I drive around. Like, I love it. It's the world news. It's international. A lot better than American propaganda, like, commercial BS too. And I think, I don't know if you said this or Nyambura, I don't know who it was, but well, it's also just like the world news. It is like the international source, whatever.
Yeah, it was
English
made because
is the same thing, right? It's like,
sorry, yeah. That their tag is the world's radio station, and also because they have so many different services. Like, you can listen to the BBC in Kiswahili or in Urdu or in Hausa or in Yoruba or whatever. There's also that level of I don't know, like there's always that question, you know, like what does representation mean, and what is an international outlet? You know, can an international outlet, an outlet with you know, a presence in multiple countries, say something about your particular experience? You know, yeah. So I'm sorry I
Yeah.
interrupted
And
you.
I think there's all kinds of ways we can reimagine identity and what it means to be from somewhere or to have that national marker on it and stuff too. Definitely, a lot of my films, that these ones from the archive, like this Where There Was No Doctor film coming up, and Ustaz, I narrate them in Arabic, in Chadian Arabic, because I feel like that's the best way to represent what I felt at the time, and it also reflects on the identity and belonging and all these kind of things, and it's the environment of where the film is. If I wanted to make it immediately more relevant to quote unquote Western audiences, I would narrate the film in English or maybe in French. Even Mohammed Saleh Haroun, I've talked with him about this actually too, a little bit. Like he's leaned towards French in a lot of his films. He's got French co-producers, he's got French audiences. Does that make his film less Chadian? Does it make it less relevant to Chadian audiences? Does it not matter at all? Are you just whoever you want to be? Is that who you are? Kind of these kind of things, which is something that he had said before. I think it's a tough one. If you look at like Ngugi Uchiongo, I don't know how to say his name, but
Ngoge
who wrote
was
like
your
about
mom.
decon. Yeah. I met him in America. Did he speak in like Kikuyu or in Swahili? No, he's speaking in English. Like the audience is the determining factor so many times. And it's very fascinating how each of us individually factor into that situation accordingly, and applies to films, to music, to literature, to books. These conversations are huge. Is it hopeless that we have to communicate in a kind of a hegemonic language, or is that hegemonic language eventually going to not be associated with any national or cultural identity anymore? I don't know.
We're always interested in this house, and now that, welcome everyone to my house. In this house, we're always interested in language. And as I said, I had a conversation, Nyambura and I had a conversation with Michael Omonwa of Surreal 16, and that was one of those things, because their collective is really keen on using local languages in their films and so on. But you know, that also raises questions of how will this film travel? There are people who have this bias against watching films with subtitles, etc. So how will your film navigate the world, and so on? We could have this conversation forever. We could bring up Ngoge and read all of the books and decolonize our minds and so on. But this is such, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I mean, for a conversation where we'd pre-gamed, you know, sometimes you have this fear when you have a pre-conversation, and when the conversation starts to be like, what do we tell each other now? But this is so good. We could keep going for ages, but like we also have to sleep. It's 10:30 p.m. in Nairobi, and it's the afternoon where you are, with a tornado on the way. So you know, please shelter. Stay safe. This as I said, Bentley, thank you so much for making time. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you especially for Revolution from Afar. Congratulations to you and your co-producer for making this really beautiful, really moving, really, insightful film. And yeah, all the best in your future projects. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you to No Direct Flight, to all the organizing groups. I know it's a British Council and different groups that are helping make this possible. It's a fantastic conversation, great opportunity. And I want to say one last thing as a good thank you here, is the No Direct Flight, like the conception of this event is reflective of these new futures and new identities, right? Like the philosophy behind it is, I think it's creating a space for this, which is so happy to be part of it. Man, let's get whatever film you get out, whatever language, let's do it. Subtitles are there. We're getting used to it, right? Everybody's getting used to subtitles. Subtitles are part of your film now. You know, let's look at films in a new way. I don't know. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. It's good to connect with someone on a deep level in this as well.
Yeah. Oh, and we should also say subtitles are fantastic for accessibility. Yes. So everybody wins. Yeah.
Everybody
wins. Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to ask our tech person to wrap us up, and we can just look into the
As you
camera
say,
and look into each other's
cut this
eyes.
slightly.